Okay, what we're going to do is dive a little deeper into input analysis, which is what we've been talking about in this whole section, and again, kind of break out some important parts of what we've learned so far. Well, let's review from a visual standpoint. So forget the math and the formulas, just from a visual standpoint. If you track the quantity of production, stuff that makes me money is the idea. You always have to input something. You have to input a quantity. That's what you have to use to create production. And this could be lots of things. Well, when you first start using this input, you get this increasing and an increasing rate reaction. But then there's a change at some point where you increase but at a decreasing rate, and then it even gets to a certain spot where you've used too much. And so that's another area where it starts to change. The slope alters all the way through here. This first one is called the point of inflection. And it really kind of is a important measure of when we go from increasing rate to increasing and decreasing rate. The other thing to point out is this top level where if you use any more fertilizer, you're burning up the crop. That's diminishing returns. And so those are important things to look at. But as we dive into production, there are ways we can look at some important things like the change or like the average. Those are two important areas. So let's talk about the change first. When you start, let's change this a little bit, change. When you start increasing production and you're moving to the point of inflection, your marginal is going way up. It's shooting up really fast. But once you get to the point of inflection, the change is dropping. And in fact, it's going to drop until it hits diminishing returns, which would be a dumb place to be. We're putting so much fertilizer on, we're killing the crop. That actually is the point there where the value is zero. In fact, if you keep using input, your production goes down. You start losing crop. That is one way we can look at marginal. So it tells us the point of inflection, and it identifies where diminishing returns would happen. Now the average, another value, so let's make it a different line. The average is always going to be below the marginal while you're starting out. But whenever production starts backing off, the average will meet it and it'll kind of level off. And so average is just exactly what the word says. It's an average. The more you produce, the less the average can share. So that's not a very straight line. But if you take the marginal and the average, where they meet together is typically identified as stage one. After that, it's called stage two. And then when you hit that diminishing returns, it's called stage three. So what are these stages all about? Well, number one, if you're in that area, you're first starting to feed the calves and they're gaining product gain right away in the first couple of weeks, that's the new production area. It's low quantity, but we're very efficient. But the trouble is we're low quantity. So really we can't quite get any profit made. You might get profit made for just a bit if you're very new in the industry. Kind of like when you open up a restaurant, everybody shows up the first week. But it's temporary. Now, stage two is where we get into another set of areas. Our averages are starting to flatten out. We're producing at a level. We got more production. This typically is where we have profit. Profit is usually found within somewhere in this stage two area. Now, stage three is easy. It's called the irrational stage of production. It doesn't have anything to do with making any money. Product's going down as we spend more input. So you got negative production as you put more input on. That's irrational. Who would want to operate in that stage? So when we look at average and marginal, they help us break out the stages of production, 1, 2, and 3. And stage 2 is typically our area. Now, that's looking at it from a graphical standpoint. Really mathematically or quantitatively, we've got numbers we can calculate, which is sometimes easier to understand. But this quantitative or mathematical view of input analysis is another way, and it relates to, again, your homework for this week as well as last. You're always going to have an input. So what are you spending money on to grow your production? And so there'll be an input, and then there'll be an output. Every time, same deal. This input's a quantity, of course, some level. Maybe it's fertilizer or feed, and that is going to then compare to some output of production of quantity. It's our product that we produce. Now, once again, the average and the marginal kind of help us see the stages. They give us some values we sometimes communicate. Average is very popular. It's something a lot of producers look at. What's the average here, the average here? What was our average last year? But we're really kind of looking at this base information and what do we know? And that would be based on input use. And so I've got a quantity of production that I'm measuring based on the input that I use. And that is my formula for the average. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the production that you have per, very important, per, it's being divided, per 1 unit of input. So 1 unit of input, or the unit of input, is what this is all based on. So for every fertilizer amount I put out there, ton, if that's the measure, what's the production? And that's the average. And it changes as we produce. Marginal is going to measure that change. So marginal is the same formula basically, but it's the change in the quantity we produce. So it's not at a level, it's between levels. It's the change in the quantity we produce divided by the change in the input that we use to make that production. It gives us another view. Now this view is nothing more than the change in production per, same thing, the change in 1 unit of the input. And that's what average and marginal do. One gives you the value at a stage, and it's going to kind of be an average. It's going to take the highs and the lows out and kind of give you a value. And marginal's measuring, is it going up fast? Is it going up slow? And so that's going to be the measure. Now, when it's not going up at all, it's going up negative. That's the irrational stage. So really, these numbers should always be positive unless we're looking at the irrational stage. So average is telling you at a particular level, here's what we have. Marginal says, well, here's what we have if you move from here to here. And those are both important questions to be able to answer, or knowledge to know. Now, this is all just telling us about what stage are we in of production. What's our yield per acre? What's our what's our yield per acre? What's our production per pound of fertilizer used? We have a farmer's market, and so we sell product based on the number of hours. We have workers out there trying to sell it. So those are all the stages of production, but we haven't really identified profit. We're just talking about averages and marginals and product. So we're going to go back to the same thing. In addition, so the rest of this table would keep going. We still have input and we still have output, but we want to look at some values. And let's start off with, let's go with the marginal input cost. So let's do that in red maybe. That'd be a better way, yeah. So marginal input cost, that's the cost of our input. And we're curious, what's the value of the product we produce from that input? So marginal input cost is the cost from 1 unit of the input. Everything's based on 1 unit of input. Homework went from 2.1 to 2.2 to 2.3, but when you divide that, you're ending up with one unit of value, even though you increase by just 0.1. So this is the cost or the price of the input, which is the same as cost per 1 unit. Now, marginal value is the revenue change. So I'm looking at the product now, but it's the change in production per the 1 unit of input. But I'm looking at the value now. So MVP is the marginal physical product from above, the change times what the product's worth, and that gives us its value. The marginal input cost gives us the cost. But both of these aren't really whole values. They're the change in cost when you use 1 more pound of fertilizer or 1 more hour of labor. And then it's the value of that change based on the product that you sell. The question is, how much should we keep pushing? We want to get in stage 2, but we got to keep pushing input use to get there. So if we take our marginal input cost and we say it's worth, let's say $10 in cost, and that's to get us, let's say go ahead and give you stages. So let's start, of course, not at stage 1, that's silly. Let's start at stage 4. So we were at 3, we went to 4, that cost $10 to get that going. Go from 4 to 5, that cost, make the 5 better, that cost $10 more. What about from 5 to 6? Cost $10 more. Every unit cost 1 more input unit. That's the calculations from above. Now, the value is the same thing. The 3 to 4 has a value of, let's say, $19. If you spend $10 to get 19, you keep going. That's good. Next level. What about 4 to 5? Well, you spend $10 more. That's the change. And you got $12. Still good. You get to keep the 19 you earned, and you're looking at the next value, which is 12, so you keep going. 5 to 6, same cost of $10 in there, but this time the value is only 8. So you would say, nope, got to stop. I can't spend $10 and get 8. Now, I might look down the rest of the production. Maybe there's some hiccup in cost that's happening in there based on quantity I bought. But if you find that that's not true, it's the marginal input cost equals the marginal value product. That's the concept of input analysis. When your marginal input cost and your marginal value product equal, that's called maximum profit. And that gives us some insight into what we're looking at. Let's review now. Marginal input cost is the change in cost. So if I spend $10, the great question is, what's the change in revenue? And that change in revenue is the question. And if it's greater than $10, you keep going. If it's less than $10, you just got to stop. And then you go back and look at what stage of change happened, and that is the idea of maximum profit. So maximum profit is understanding MIC and MVP. You don't get to understand that till you talk about the stages of production or the averages. So that's one way to measure. And then you get down to marginal physical product, and then you can start moving into the change in cost, change in revenue. We've pushed production out as far as we can of using that input to make the most money or to make the most product possible, managing how much input we are using. Because in this particular formula or case, that's what we're looking at, input analysis.